you know, things that they either didn't document or that they can prove weren't done sort of according to the book. But in terms of what was released into the air or potentially into the soil as a result of the bad practices, there just isn't enough data yet. And so a lot that came out of that was, well, how do we as a community, how does the EPA and ATSDR play a role in making sure we can get the data so we know whether or not we have problems. One of the big questions that we had that was also discussed in the article from today was, you know, there are some schools that are very close to these facilities. Elementary school in St. Francis and Rufus King High School, as well as another number of other schools, elementary schools, and are next to the Milwaukee facility. And we all know that children experience exposure to some of these things and are more sensitive to exposure to some of these things than adults or maybe the general population are. And so that, to me, was a red flag. And it isn't necessarily to say that, you know, we're in danger or we're in trouble, but it is to say that there were some things that weren't done correctly, and we've got to make sure that we're not. What else are we working on?
Actually, I'd just like to add on that the company was fined and found that they did pour chemicals into the system that goes, you know, to MMSE. Anyway, and so they had, of course, told us, we didn't do anything, nothing's wrong, woo, woo, woo. And then after connecting with the Congresswoman's office and Senator Baldwin's office, they did have the investigations done, and the federal agencies got involved because the whistleblower was someone that I got connected to, and so her office was able to do that work. But I just want to say that even though it's like not next to you, it still affected us because they literally poured stuff in the sewer system, you know, into the system where the water is. So we really want to thank the Congresswoman's office for the follow-up at the federal level.
Yeah, I think the other big question that sort of concerned me is the employees there. I mean, it's sort of lower tier, I don't want to say tier employees, but you know, people who make lower wages and may not have the job options that some people have. And they were mixing sort of this stew of these chemicals together, and it's sort of, well, you know, if it's all food waste, then it's no big deal, nobody really cares, but you don't know that, and a lot of these things are unmarked, and they're just pouring them all in the same container, and you know, it could just be as simple as bleach and ammonia, and then all of a sudden you have a sort of stew that is going to poison a lot of folks. So that's another issue we're active on. I know something that hasn't quite come to light yet, but is being discussed, and I know it doesn't really affect Shorewood, but it's something we've been working on, is that they're discussing closing a Social Security office on the near south side, and so of course we're in contact with the city and Social Security to try and find a way to make sure they stay open. Now, Social Security claims it was just they couldn't find the appropriate space in a safe area with parking and all of the things that meet their requirements. And I think it's sort of a smokescreen for just wanting to close the office personally. I've heard rumors about that for years, that they wanted to close that particular office. And the city recently offered up the new library off the National, that in the mixed use space, the second floor of that space is vacant, and it's a beautiful space. So, and now again, I don't know what all their requirements are at this point because Social Security has become very tight-lipped since we got involved. But that's another thing we're working on. I suppose you probably, I kept it pretty local thus far, but I suppose actually I meant to stop earlier. I wanted to thank President Johnson for having us. He and the Congresswoman talk at least on a yearly basis, and we're always very excited to work with Tyler and President Johnson about anything that's facing the community of Shorewood. The Congresswoman was excited to have Shorewood in her district when we got redistricting completed, and so we're happy to call you constituents, if I'm just trying to butter the crowd up, I suppose. On the federal level, I think the biggest thing facing us, right, is, so we did $1.5 trillion for these tax breaks. Now, the Congresswoman didn't vote for that. I personally am kind of questioning, okay, we did this $1.5 trillion for these tax breaks. Well, okay, where'd the fiscal conservatives go? I don't want to call myself a budget hawk because I'm not a budget hawk, but I do think you got to kind of weigh, how you spend things and how you collect revenue, and you got to have a little bit of a balance. And then all of a sudden you see sort of this dichotomy occurring with the current budget negotiations, right? In the House, you have about 36 super, I don't even want to call them fiscal conservatives, but they do tend to trend in that direction, who are holding the feet of the Republican Party to the fire on some of this spending level stuff. But then you also have, in the Senate, apparently it became open season over the last 2 weeks, and they've got this giant bill that's it's the biggest budget bill the Republicans have ever passed, and apparently nobody cares about austerity anymore. Which, quite frankly, at the time we were caring about austerity, it was the wrong time to care about austerity. I mean, the only way to you have to spend your way out of a recession. And we did some of that, but it was in the wrong places and it wasn't fast enough. I certainly think we could have shortened it up by a couple of years had some of the stimulus money's been more wisely distributed or spent. Headed into March and April here, it's sort of an ever-changing set of goalposts, but Democrats, I think, would like to focus on infrastructure. The senator mentioned a lot of things about our crumbling infrastructure, and she's absolutely right. We have not invested in our infrastructure, and my undergrad was in political science, so I'll just go back to that, right? True conservative economic thought process deems infrastructure as like one of the few things that you're allowed to debt spend on, because it should return the investment over time. And so the fact that we've ignored something that could be a net gain on our investment is, for as long as we've ignored it, is silly. I know the Congresswoman over the years has proposed she'd like to see a national infrastructure bank, similar to the way we do, there's the Clean Water State and Federal Revolving Loan Funds. So what that does for you is you essentially allow communities of all sizes to borrow at for specific types of items at lower than even bond rates. It gives you the opportunity to stretch that cost out as long as possible and make it as palatable as possible without not taxing, without paying interest to death on the process. That's where Democrats would like to focus. Speaker Ryan has, I think, probably since he's been elected, wanted to focus on cutting some of the social safety net programs. As you're probably all aware, my boss is unapologetically run on protecting the social safety net and protecting the people who that safety net protects. And so in her mind, I know that's the next big fight, as much as we'd like to focus on infrastructure. And keeping in mind, we just deficit spended $1.5 trillion, but all of a sudden we're short on money for programs, half of which have line item taxes. And at the moment are self-sustaining. Now, of course, there's projections that say otherwise, and we do have to get a handle on that. But it's not like we're going to recoup that $1.5 trillion by cutting our way to death over here on the social safety net side. And the Senate certainly kicked that can down the road with this current budget proposal that they're talking about tonight. Now, forgive me if it voted and something happened in the last 45 minutes, because I haven't checked my phone in the last 45 minutes, but I've been trying to keep up to date with where that is. I'll stop right there because, I don't know that I could even project out any farther than April. But we can do some questions if anybody has any. I feel like I've been...
I'm curious to know for Wentworth's impact or interest H-1B visa policies for the nation, because I've lost my job because of that, and I'm now on the public assistance programs that have been... And it's, for the first time in my life as a middle-aged woman, I'm stymied at this experience, especially in light of the fact that my track record is really good.
Yeah, the H-1B process is a broken process. I certainly think that there's a time and a place for, let me give you an example. I used to work for a guy who ran a medical clinic. And the medical clinic needed a specialist in a certain type of medical research. Now, finding that specialist was really difficult because typically someone who's a practicing physician makes more than a doctor who's a researcher. And so he ended up connecting with someone who was Indian and now has lived here, I think, for 25 years, and brought him here to run, this research facility. That's an instance in which the H-1B process works, right? But then on the converse side, right, you saw what happened with, and I don't remember the specific telecom, but it was a telecom in California where they hired, I think, about 60 or 100 H-1B folks, and then the folks that they were displacing they were training, they were literally training their replacements.
That was my experience.
And the process is supposed to allow for essentially certification that you're not displacing workers. But the verification and the follow through on that end of the process has become a completely broken system. And it's become more of this football of the politics of it gets strange. I'll say this much, because frequently Democrats are aligned very much with the tech industry. Tech industry tends to be a more liberal industry, by and large, not across the board. But the tech industry, quite frankly, is one of the big abusers of the H-1B process.
That's where I lost my job.
And so the conversation about okay, so how do we appropriately limit that and make sure that all the verification is done correctly?
How do Americans recover from that displacement? I would like to hear stories about that.
So there's a displaced workers program that is underfunded and
I went through the HIRE program here in Wisconsin, and they didn't really know what to do with me.
Yeah,
and so it ended up as a dead end for me as an American.
I don't have a good answer to that.
Okay, that's fine.
No, what I'll say is the long answer is the Congresswoman thinks, or the short answer is the Congresswoman thinks that it's a broken system and that we need to fix it, and that the whole idea that you would displace an American worker simply to save money is asinine, excuse my language.
And so I'm interested with your Foxconn perception, very interested, because that's my background, that's my field of technology. But I'm not sure how to approach it, so if you have.
Well, you do have my office information,
I can give
and I'd be very happy for you to call the office for us to tell you about what things may be happening so that you can connect to opportunities to see what professional options actually exist for people connected to Foxconn, as well as the jobs that may not be tech, but will be in the building that they will have downtown. Or for that matter, what services might be available for you through state agencies that exist that help individuals who are trying to reconnect to work.
Yeah, it's been
A long time.
December 2015.
Alrighty then.
Isn't that fraud, what you're talking about is fraud of the immigration, or is it legal?
I believe-
Are you consider yourself a whistleblower?
I believe it's a form of fraud. That's what I believe.
Yeah.
I can't speak to it.
Unfortunately, immigration is not my
But-
specialty,
but
so I'm
with
not
the-
sure.
Yeah, I just was curious about the business aspect of H1, and like you said, there was a medical physician who was truly a specialist, truly. My experience was with people shortly out of college that I was expected to bring up to speed in the tech industry, and subsequently being
So,
replaceable.
If I may, I just want to make sure that we keep
So-
going, but this might be something that
But
maybe
yeah, it's-
offline
it's-
that we could
Yeah,
talk about
it's
to see
a
what
really
can be
good-
done. I think
it's
that
a
would
really
be
good
a,
piece.
I can give you my card. I do want to do just one last call for a last question if there was any other things that we missed along the way. No. Okay, I'll leave some cards with Tyler, and so if anybody wants to get in contact with me, You know, I live in Glendale, I work in our downtown office,
Yeah,
so I'm right
I'll
here.
take one.
Yeah,
I'd
absolutely.
be curious to hear the specifics on what the council wanted.
I can get you,
and
getting more information is fine, I just,
I'd like to understand why it worked for them, the contracting company, but not for me as an American.
we have a woman in our office who actually deals specifically with immigration,
Thank
so
you.
I'll actually be asking her.
That's fine, thank you.
Would anybody like to take maps before I go? Oh, sorry. Have to, yeah, sorry. Anyone else take maps?
I'm fine.
So if we could give Dan a round of applause and thank him. Dan, I thought you were a great fill-in, so you were a hard worker to yourself. The last half hour, we're gonna transition to municipal. So we have our village president, Guy Johnson, who will be presenting over the next 15 to 20 minutes here. And then our village clerk will talk more about how we do elections operationally here with the village. So, kick it off with President Johnson.